She was once a princess, once a wife, a mother, a queen. But when she died, no bells tolled, no court wept, no monument was raised, no funeral was held. Because when the body of Sophia Dorothea of Celle finally stopped breathing, no one outside her prison even knew she was still alive. She had been locked away for 30 years. No trial, no sentence. Her crime? She had loved the wrong man. Her husband? The future King of England. The man she loved? A soldier, not a prince. The punishment? A life buried behind walls in a castle stripped of windows, without visitors, without voice. They called her mad. They called her whore. But they never called her by her name again. She was erased, not just from the kingdom, but from history itself. And behind the towering stone of Alden House, where winter seeped into the bones and time stood still, she whispered through locked doors, not of treason, nor ambition, but of a single night when she felt truly seen. Was she really a traitor to the crown? Or just a woman born into a world that feared love more than war? Tonight, we open the rusted gate of her silence. We walk the cold hallways she once paced, barefoot and alone. We piece together the torn letters, the sealed portraits, the forbidden dreams. This is not just a royal scandal. This is the autopsy of power, and the slow suffocation of a woman who dared to want something more than duty. This is the forgotten tragedy of Sophia Dorothea of Celle, the queen who was locked away for loving the wrong man. She was not born to rule. She was born to make peace. When Sophia Dorothea came into the world on September 15th, 1666, in the quiet duchy of Celle, she wasn't greeted with trumpets or the weight of empire. She was the only child of George William, Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg, and his longtime mistress-turned-wife, Éléonore d'Emier d'Olbreuse, a French noblewoman of modest standing. Their union was, in every sense, a scandal. He had vowed to remain unmarried in favor of his brother's dynastic ambitions, but broke that promise for love. Their daughter, then, was an embarrassment and a solution. She was not meant to shine. She was meant to stitch. Because what Sophia Dorothea carried in her veins was dangerous. Her birth was a bruise on the carefully painted portrait of dynastic pride. She was the child of a morganatic marriage, noble in name, but not in bloodline. A compromise, a wound to protocol. But time, as it often does in courts, turned scandal into strategy. The royal houses of Europe were always searching for pawns. And Sophia Dorothea, beautiful, spirited, sharp, became a vessel of political convenience. Her marriage could mean unity. Her dowry could mean territory. Her silence could mean survival. She was groomed not for power, but for usefulness. By age 10, she had already learned what her value was. Not her mind, not her heart, but her ability to be married off to the right man at the right time. She spoke French like a courtier, German like a noble. She smiled when smiled at. She curtsied until her knees ached. But inside, she was restless. The quiet halls of Celle could not hold her thoughts. She read voraciously. She wrote in her diaries. She watched the swans on the water and dreamed of a life that was hers to choose. And then came Ernest Augustus, Elector of Hanover, a powerful man with ambitions. He needed to secure his dynasty. He had 5 sons. The eldest was George Louis, a stiff, cold figure, military-minded, humorless, lacking grace. but endowed with a crown-shaped destiny. And so it was arranged. The Duke of Celle would offer his daughter and a fat dowry. Ernest Augustus would offer his son and a future throne. Sophia Dorothea had no say. When the proposal came, she was 16. She is said to have screamed, cried, begged. She had never met George Louis. She had heard stories, none of them kind. He was said to be awkward, arrogant, unfeeling, but none of that mattered, because Sophia Dorothea was not marrying for love. She was marrying for a German unification. Their wedding was held in 1682. The bride wore pearls and silver. The groom, cold silence. The night before, she had written a single line in her diary. "I fear I will never laugh again." And she was right. Their first night as husband and wife was not marked by intimacy, but by distance. George Louis treated her with disdain. She, in turn, found his presence unbearable. Their marriage bed was a symbol of treaty, not tenderness. What was expected of her was simple. Bear sons, behave well, keep her head bowed. And still, she tried. For a time, Sophia Dorothea performed the role history demanded of her. She bore 2 children, a son, George Augustus, who would later become George II of Great Britain, and a daughter. She attended court functions. She smiled beside her husband. But beneath the silks and jewels, she was drowning. She wrote letters to her mother, letters full of sorrow, of confusion, of aching loneliness. She was surrounded by courtiers who viewed her as a stain on royal bloodlines. Even her own mother-in-law, Sophia of the Palatinate, despised her, calling her a creature of vulgar breeding. They whispered behind fans. They mocked her French roots. They scorned her for not being submissive enough, silent enough, dull enough. And yet she glowed. Even in this gilded cage, Sophia Dorothea refused to wither. She laughed with her ladies. She danced when music played. She wrote poetry. She sewed, not out of obligation, but to still her shaking hands. But above all, she waited. Waited for what? She couldn't say. Perhaps for a letter. Perhaps for a voice that called her by name, not title. Perhaps for someone who saw the girl behind the bargain. And soon, that someone would arrive. Not a king, not a diplomat, but a man with a sword and a crooked smile. But that is another story. The palace they lived in had no dungeons, only salons, chandeliers, tapestries spun in gold. But for Sophia Dorothea, Hanover was a prison of mirrors and marble, where she saw herself reflected everywhere, but never truly seen. The wedding may have been a political triumph, but the marriage? It was a quiet war. George Louis was a man of discipline. He rose early. He hunted with precision. He spoke little. He treated affection like a liability. To him, Sophia Dorothea was not a wife. She was an asset secured, a contract fulfilled. And more than that, an irritation, a woman too clever, too spirited, too alive. He kept her close enough to control, but far enough to disregard. When he looked at her, he saw her father's betrayal, the morganatic blood, the French tongue, the scandal sewn into her skin. He never called her darling, never kissed her in public. He called her that Celle woman. And so, from the very beginning, Sophia Dorothea understood this was not a love story. This was an arrangement. She wore silks. She bore children. She waved from balconies. But her days were haunted by a profound silence, not just in the halls, but in her heart. She once wrote, "The sun rises and sets, but nothing in between belongs to me." When she gave birth to her son, George Augustus, she hoped, perhaps foolishly, that motherhood might warm the cold space between them. But George Louis barely acknowledged the child. He saw his heir, not his son. And Sophia, she was left in a nursery surrounded by nannies and noblewomen who reported her every move to his mother. Sophia of the Palatinate, George Louis's formidable mother, ruled the court like a general. She hated Sophia Dorothea with a precise cruelty, cutting her out of ceremonies, belittling her letters, mocking her manners. She once wrote to a friend, "She has the pride of a peacock, but the blood of a laundress." In such a court, joy was dangerous. A smile could be misconstrued. A glance could be a weapon. Sophia Dorothea learned to walk slowly, speak carefully, and cry only behind locked doors. Her days blurred into repetition, breakfast with cold bread and colder silence, afternoons pacing gardens alone, evenings of formal dinners where conversation was whispered and laughter was rare. But what made it unbearable was not hatred. It was indifference. George Louis had mistresses, openly. He spent nights away from her chambers, sometimes entire weeks. When they dined together, he corrected her grammar before servants. When she danced at court balls, he watched other women. And still, she was expected to remain loyal, grateful, silent. She tried. She wrote poetry. She embroidered tapestries with images of freedom, birds flying from cages, ships at sea, windows open to light. She dreamed of Paris, of music, of conversations that were not whispered through clenched teeth. But freedom is not safe in the halls of monarchy, because in courts like Hanover, everything was watched. Everything was recorded, even the loneliness. And loneliness, in women, was called rebellion. The courtiers began to whisper, "She stays too long in the gardens. She reads too many French novels. She is restless," as if suffering itself was an act of defiance. And perhaps it was. Perhaps Sophia Dorothea's greatest sin was not adultery or insolence. Perhaps it was the refusal to disappear. She walked upright. She wore color when others wore gray. She looked people in the eye. And in a world built on deference and silence, that was dangerous. George Louis grew colder. He scolded her for imagined slights. He sent her jewels she never asked for, and then accused her of ingratitude when she failed to wear them. Once, she threw a necklace into the fire. Another time, she broke a mirror with a candlestick. But what was most telling was this. She stopped writing in her diary, not because she had nothing left to say, but because no one was listening. She was not mad. She was not wicked. She was not unfaithful. Not yet. She was simply a woman, left in the cold, a wife, a mother, sleeping in a palace where the sheets were silk, but the air was ice. She wrote to her mother, "I live surrounded by stone hearts," and yet she held on. Until the day he walked in, a cavalry officer, a man with wit, with stories, with fire in his eyes, a friend from childhood, now returned from the front. Count Philipp Christoph von Königsmarck, but that story, that kiss, that fall, belongs to another chapter. She had forgotten what it felt like to laugh. Not the polite, measured chuckle she offered at court, but the kind of laugh that escapes without permission, sharp, sudden, alive. It returned to her lips on a summer afternoon, when a voice, familiar, teasing, echoed down the gallery of the palace. "My lady, have you traded your crown for shadows?" She turned, and there he stood, Philip Christoph von Königsmarck, Swedish noble, soldier of fortune, and once a boy who had thrown snowballs at her in the gardens of Celle. Years had passed, but his eyes still carried mischief, and his smile, it had not dulled. He bowed low, too low for formality. When he rose, he winked. It was scandalous, improper, irresistible. Sophia Dorothea smiled, then laughed, not because she wanted to, but because for the first time in years she forgot not to. They told each other lies first, that they were happy, that life had been kind, that the past didn't haunt them. But the truth crept in slowly, like ink spilled across linen. Philip had returned from war, decorated, bruised, alive in body but wearied in soul. He had seen battlefields, betrayals, but what shook him most was the quiet suffering he now saw in her. He had remembered her as a girl full of light. Now she moved like a ghost in silk, and yet he found her more radiant than ever. Not because she glowed, but because she refused to flicker out. At first, they met only in passing. A stolen word between tapestries, a glance across the ballroom. A book slipped into her hand, a novel banned at court. She read it in one night. It was about two lovers who met in secret, wrote letters in code, and dreamed of running away together. She underlined one sentence: "The heart cannot forget what it has never been allowed to know." The palace began to breathe differently. When Philip entered a room, she sat straighter. When she walked by, he fell silent, listening. It was not yet love. It was something more dangerous. Possibility. In a world that crushed women for dreaming, Sophia Dorothea had begun to dream again. She dreamed of riding horses at dawn, not for show, but for joy. Of speaking French without being mocked. Of being kissed not as duty, but as desire. And Philip? He dreamed too, of freeing her, of burning the invisible bars of her prison, of rescuing a queen not with armies, but with a whispered yes. Their affair, if one could call it that yet, was made of moments too brief and too loud in her heart. A letter left beneath her pillow. A glove dropped and returned. Weeks later, wrapped in lavender. A dance. Just one. Where he touched her back half a second too long. The court began to notice. George Lewis's spies, already suspicious, sharpened their gaze. Courtiers gossiped. She blushes now. She smiles again. She walks in the garden too often. But none dared confront her, because no one wanted to know what might be true. Except Sophie of the Palatinate. She saw it. She feared it. And she moved to stop it. She forbade Philip from entering the private wing. She dismissed one of Sophia Dorothea's maids. She began to read her letters. But what they couldn't read, what they couldn't confiscate, was what had already bloomed inside her. It was not yet love. It was longing. And longing is a dangerous thing for a woman with nothing to lose. Then came the night of the garden. The moon was full, the air warm, and Sophia Dorothea, ignoring the pounding in her chest, slipped away from her chambers. Philip was waiting, not in uniform, but in plain clothes. A man, not a soldier. They didn't speak much. Words had become too fragile. He kissed her, not like a prince, not like a husband, but like a man who had waited a lifetime for one breath. And in that kiss, she remembered who she was before the crown, before the silence, before the insults, before the prison of mirrors. She was not a duchess, not a queen. She was a woman with skin and fire and a name, Sophia. But history does not forgive women who remember themselves, especially not when they do so with another man. The next morning, the walls of the palace felt closer. The portraits watched more carefully. The silence was heavier. And somewhere beyond the tapestries and courtyards, a hand began to write her downfall. Because in courts ruled by fear, love is not romantic. It is sedition. And Sophia Dorothea had just committed her first act of treason, not against the crown, but against the idea that she should not feel at all. The affair was never loud. It didn't need to be. It lived in the folds of silk letters, in the corners of eyes that dared not meet in public. It lived in silences and locked doors. For months, Sophia Dorothea and Königsmarck conducted their love like prisoners escaping one brick at a time. They did not write names. They used codes. April meant Sophia. Star meant Philip. Rain meant danger. And still, they wrote. Dozens of letters, now scattered across European archives, survived. Each one fevered, aching, terrified. "I burn for you," he once wrote. "Your name is carved in the air I breathe. You do not know what it means to me, to be seen again." She replied, "They want me to be silent, Philip. But even silence can scream. When I press my hand against the window, I imagine it pressing into yours." They exchanged gifts in secret. A ribbon, a locket, a lock of hair. They became children again, hiding from giants in a world built on punishment. But in Hanover, walls do not sleep, and the palace they thought they had outwitted had begun to listen. A maid found a torn note. A valet overheard a name. A courtier glimpsed a shadow in the wrong corridor. The rumors no longer whispered, they shouted. George Louis remained publicly aloof, but in private, his rage fermented. He did not scream, he planned. Sophia of the Palatinate took charge. She was not just a mother, she was a strategist, and she would not let a Celle woman bring disgrace to her son's future throne. She summoned her agents, hired spies, opened letters before they reached their hands. But what she could not erase, what terrified her most, was not lust. It was intimacy, because intimacy creates loyalty, and loyalty to someone other than the dynasty is unforgivable. Then came the night the door did not open. Philip had promised to come. A signal had been arranged. A servant had been bribed. She waited, heart pounding, candle burning low. But he never arrived. The next morning, his boots were found in the courtyard. Blood smeared the stones. No body, no noise, no trial, just absence. And in the eyes of the court, confirmation. They had found the smoking gun. They did not confront her with accusation. They did worse. They denied her answers. No one told her what had happened. Not her husband, not her mother-in-law, not the guards who now followed her from chamber to chamber. She was moved to another wing. Her letters were burned, her clothes taken, her ladies dismissed. When she asked about Philip, they said, He is gone. Gone where? Gone, she screamed. They closed the door. She wept. They took away her ink. She stopped speaking. They brought in a priest. It was not a prison made of bars. It was a prison of erasure. No trial, no crime officially named, no verdict read aloud. But every door she reached for was locked. Her children were taken from her sight. She was not allowed to see them, to write to them, to know if they asked for her. George Louis filed for separation, not divorce, because divorce was beneath a future king. No. He simply had the marriage declared null, as if it had never existed. And with that, Sophia Dorothea was officially no one. The place they sent her was called Alden House. Not a dungeon, not a fortress, but a manor on the edge of silence. To the outside world, it was a retirement for a wayward duchess. To her, it was a tomb with wallpaper. She was 33, and she would never leave it again. They told the world she was mad, that she had written letters to ghosts, that she had tried to escape dressed as a man, that she had plotted with traitors. None of it was true. But truth dies quickly in the mouths of kings. And Sophia Dorothea, who once dreamed of Paris and poetry, now lived in a house where the windows were nailed shut, and the clocks no longer chimed. She was allowed no mirrors, no letters, no news from the court. The guards were instructed, do not speak to her unless spoken to. And if she asks questions, smile and walk away. But even in that silence, she refused to vanish. She planted roses in the garden. She sang lullabies when no one listened. She whispered Philip's name each night before sleep. She wrote poems on napkins. She sewed birds into her curtains, each one facing the sky. And on her birthday, she scratched the wall with a broken brooch. He loved me. That was enough. Her love was not the scandal. Her silence was. Because the court wanted a spectacle, she gave them memory, and memory is harder to kill than any man. She was still alive. But in the court of Hanover, she no longer existed. There was no mention of her name in official records. No portraits of her hung in the palace. Her former rooms were sealed, her presence erased with such precision that even the dust seemed instructed to forget her. The woman once called Duchess, once called wife, had become an echo forbidden to repeat itself. George Louis did not mourn her disappearance. He did not speak of it. He simply filled the silence with promotion. He became Elector of Hanover. Then, in 1714, after the death of Queen Anne of England, he ascended to the throne of Great Britain as King George I. And when he crossed the Channel to sit on the English throne, he did so without a queen by his side. Because his queen, Sophia Dorothea, was still locked in a country manor, her windows sealed, her voice stolen. At his coronation, she was not mentioned. In England, she was never acknowledged as queen. Instead, he brought his mistresses, German women dressed in British jewels, seated at the king's right and left. They were called the Elephant and the Maypole behind closed doors. The court laughed, but no one whispered about the woman who still signed her letters when she was allowed to write as S. She had become an absence too dangerous to name. Sophia of the Palatinate. George's mother ensured it. Even after death, her reach lingered. In the courtiers she trained, in the letters she left behind. One note preserved in private collection reads, "A woman must understand that once she chooses feeling over duty, she must be prepared to be forgotten by both." And so, Sophia Dorothea was forgotten. Deliberately, systematically, even her children were taught to speak of her as a mistake. Her son, George Augustus, heir to the British throne, was told never to write her name, and he didn't, not even once. But memory has its own rebellion. Sometimes it survives in places no decree can touch. In Alden House, the walls cracked with damp. The furniture rotted from within. But in the bedroom where she slept, a candle was always lit. And every year, on the same day in July, a fresh white rose would appear on her windowsill, though no servant claimed to have placed it. She grew thinner. Her hair grayed before her time. But her eyes, those bright, knowing eyes, never lost their defiance. When local villagers passed by the manor, they spoke in hushed tones of the ghost woman who watches from behind the curtains. Some said she was mad. Others, braver, called her cursed. But no one denied this. She was still there. And that made the court nervous. Back in London, George I began to age. His reign was stable, but loveless. His English courtiers resented his German ways. He rarely spoke the language. He rarely smiled. In public, he was a king. In private, he was a man who had locked away the only person who had ever dared challenge his coldness. Historians later noted his particular hatred of music that reminded him of Hanover, especially a ballad once sung in Celle years ago. When it was played by accident at a banquet, he stood, pale and trembling, and left the hall without explanation. That night, he ordered all court musicians to be replaced. He never explained why. But a servant claimed, quietly after his death, that the king had whispered in German, "It sounded like her." In Alden, Sophia Dorothea waited. Not for rescue, not for justice, but for a moment that would belong to her again. She wrote in secret, smuggled letters to old friends, few of whom dared reply. She planted a fig tree, watched it grow, named it Königsmark, and once, on a clear night, she stood on the roof and sang an old French lullaby. The guards did not stop her. Perhaps they were afraid. Perhaps they were moved. Or perhaps, in that moment, they saw her not as a prisoner, but as a woman who had refused to be erased. But the body does not forget grief, and neither does time. Her health began to decline. Her joints stiffened. Her breath shortened. Her heart, once defiant, now beat slower, not in surrender, but in exhaustion. When a physician was finally sent from Hanover, he diagnosed her with melancholia compounded by neglect. He prescribed warm broth, soft blankets, and prayer. She accepted none. Instead, she asked him one question: "Do they still remember my name?" He did not answer, because in court, they didn't. But across the countryside, in whispers and poems, her legend grew. She became a tale mothers told daughters. Never trust a crown to guard your heart. She became a ghost of romance, not because she died, but because she had lived without being allowed to live at all. And to many, that was worse. She did not die all at once. She died slowly, like a flame retreating into its own smoke, like the ink of a forgotten letter, fading into yellowed parchment. By 1720, Sophia Dorothea of Celle was no longer the sharp-witted girl who once defied princes. She had become a figure draped in silence, a woman of 60, her once golden hair now silver, her spine bent not by age, but by decades of solitude. The manor at Alden was still intact, but inside it had rotted. Mice chewed at the velvet of unused chairs. The piano in the drawing room stood untouched, its keys broken, its music long gone. The hallways echoed not with voices, but with her slow, deliberate footsteps as she paced from window to window like a shipwrecked soul searching for a lighthouse that never came. She spoke less. A sentence here, a name there. But most of the time, she simply looked out the window. Not at anything, just outward, as if her eyes could break through glass, over fields, through time itself. Back to that summer night in the garden when a soldier had once whispered her name, like it mattered. Her hands shook, not from age, but from holding on too long to a world that never offered her mercy. The guards changed over the years. Some young and terrified of the rumors, others old and indifferent. One wrote in a letter, "She does not threaten, she does not beg, but when she looks at you, you feel guilty, like you've stolen something and cannot remember what." The fig tree she had planted, Königsmark, had grown tall by then. Its roots broke through the brick, its branches curled toward her window as if trying to reach her. But the window never opened. Not once in 30 years. Then came the winter of 1726. Unforgiving, violent, hungry. Snow piled up against the manor walls. Frost crept through the cracks in the stone. And Sophia Dorothea, now frail, now coughing blood, was moved to the smallest room, with the thickest walls, the lowest ceiling. She said nothing. When a servant brought warm broth, she touched the bowl, but did not drink. When asked if she wanted a priest, she shook her head. "I've already spoken to God," she said. "He listens more than kings." Her final days were not marked by screams or sobs. There was no scene, no confession, no noble last words. She simply sat in her chair, wrapped in the same shawl she'd worn since her youth, now threadbare, but still perfumed faintly with lavender and loss. One morning the maid entered and found her asleep, or so she thought. The candle beside her had burned out. The window was frosted over. A letter, half written, rested on her lap. It was addressed to no one. The ink had frozen in the bottle beside her. Sophia Dorothea of Celle was pronounced dead on November 13th, 1826. She was 60 years old. She died in exile, in silence, in a house with no mirrors, no portraits, and no funeral bells. George I, then King of Great Britain, was informed days later. His response? "Bury her quietly. She was never my wife." There was no state funeral, no mourning period, no royal carriage to carry her coffin. Instead, she was buried in a small Lutheran chapel near Alden. No inscription, no flowers. Her grave, if one could call it that, was a patch of frozen earth hastily covered, as if even in death her presence remained too inconvenient to acknowledge. No one from the Hanover court attended. Her son, now King George II, refused to visit. Not out of hatred, but obedience. He had been raised to believe she was dangerous, that her touch was contamination, that her love, once spoken, had nearly ruined them all. But somewhere, deep within the cold halls of Kensington, he wept. Only once, only briefly, but enough. Because grief has its own language, and sometimes it sounds like silence breaking. And yet, something strange happened. Weeks after her burial, villagers near Alden reported seeing a figure in the garden. A woman in a pale gown, brushing her fingers against the fig tree. Others swore they heard singing from the old chapel. A lullaby in French, soft and low. The guards dismissed it. But they did not stay long in that post. The house was closed. The key turned, and Alden, once her prison, became a sealed wound in the countryside. She was gone, but not finished, because death cannot erase what silence has already preserved. Her letters, hidden in attics, forgotten in trunks, began to resurface. Fragments of poetry, notes in code, a torn page with her initials stitched into the corner. And suddenly, the world remembered. Not the scandal, not the shame, but the woman who waited 30 years to be heard. The British throne had a king. It had ministers, armies, colonies stretching across oceans. It had jewels, laws, parliaments, and pageantry. But it did not have a queen. Not truly. Because the woman who should have stood beside George I at coronations, at banquets, in paintings and on coinage, had died behind locked doors, unseen and unsung. And in her absence, the monarchy did something it rarely does. It pretended nothing had happened. There was no black cloth draped over court portraits, no day of mourning, no public acknowledgement. Her death was a footnote in a diplomatic ledger. Sophia Dorothea of Celle, deceased November 1726, interred privately. That was it. No mention of who she had been, no mention of what had been done to her. No mention that for 30 years she had been the king's wife in all but name, and his prisoner in all but shackles. The silence spoke volumes, because the crown did not want to remember, because if they remembered, they would have to explain. Explain why a queen was never crowned, why a marriage was annulled without trial, why a woman with royal blood died alone in rural obscurity. And most of all, they would have to explain what her crime had been. Was it adultery? No court ever proved it. Was it treason? No act was committed. What then? A glance, a letter, a kiss in a garden? Not enough for a noose, but enough for disappearance, George. I never spoke her name again, not even on his deathbed. He died in 1727, just 8 months after Sophia. While traveling back to Hanover, away from the English court he never truly loved, and perhaps running from a memory he never truly buried. Some said he was felled by a stroke. Others whispered it was grief he had no words for. His body was returned to Hanover, buried beside his parents, not beside his wife, because she was never acknowledged as one. George II, Sophia's son, now ruled both Britain and Hanover. And though he followed the silence of his father, something had shifted. He never spoke of his mother, but he never denied her again either. When asked about her, he would reply, "She was my mother, that is all." Just 5 words. But for a king in a time when women were erased by decree, it was an admission with the weight of thunder. And then, the stories began. Not official records, not court papers, but whispers, passed through servant corridors, sewn into songs, hidden in the margins of books. Children in Hanover were told bedtime tales about a beautiful queen locked away for love. Ballads emerged in the German countryside, melancholy verses of a woman in white pacing her tower, calling out for a man who never returned. Even in England, long after her death, pamphlets circulated with titles like The Forgotten Wife of George I, The Rose of Alden, Her Majesty Without a Crown. The monarchy dismissed them as fiction, but fiction, like smoke, always comes from fire. Historians today still argue, was she truly innocent? Was Königsmarck murdered, or did he flee? But what no one debates anymore is this: she was punished without justice. She was exiled without crime. She was forgotten on purpose. And in doing so, the court revealed more about itself than about her. Because in trying to erase her, they revealed what power fears most. Not rebellion, not violence, but a woman who refuses to be silent. One diplomat who had met her as a child wrote in his memoirs, "I do not remember her face, but I remember her presence. She made rooms feel brighter until they tried to cage her, and then the light did not dim, it turned cold." Another, years later, wrote from Paris, "There are women who die once, and there are women whose absence becomes a mirror for the entire kingdom. Sophia Dorothea was the latter. The Hanoverian dynasty survived. It ruled for generations, but the stain never left. Because every royal procession that marched without a queen, every coronation where a second woman stood where the first should have been, every coin pressed with a single profile was a reminder that power may bury a body, but it cannot bury a story. In Alden, the manor eventually crumbled. Its roof caved in, its windows shattered. But the fig tree remained. Locals refused to cut it down. They say it still blossoms in late spring, and that if you listen closely in the early morning mist, you can hear footsteps, soft, deliberate, moving through the garden. What was she? A traitor? A whore? A woman with loose morals and dangerous desires? Or was she a prisoner of her era? A scapegoat for a husband who never loved her? A woman who reached for freedom and was punished for daring to feel? History has never quite agreed. In the decades following her death, Sophia Dorothea of Celle became less a person than a question. A name that summoned conflict in the minds of biographers, historians, and royal apologists. Some, mostly aligned with Hanoverian tradition, painted her as the villain of her own story. They said she was unstable. They said she flirted too freely. They pointed to the coded letters, the midnight walks, the missing body of Königsmark. They claimed that if she had remained dutiful, if she had not challenged the cold silence of her arranged marriage, she might have lived comfortably, even become queen. But these same voices failed to explain one crucial detail. She was never given a trial. Not once did the court charge her formally. Not once did they present her with a defense. Not once was she allowed to speak in her own name. She was judged not by law, but by whispers, glances, and fears. And that, above all else, is what shatters the case against her. Because history, for all its records and archives, often treats emotion as suspicion, especially in women. A woman who writes love letters is seen as manipulative. A man who writes them is called passionate. A queen who seeks affection is scandalous. A king who sleeps with courtesans is just expected. And in this double standard, Sophia Dorothea was buried twice. Once in life, once in narrative. But not everyone accepted the official silence. As the Enlightenment swept Europe, thinkers began to question inherited power, and with it, the stories it had erased. Writers from France, from England, even from Hanover itself began to reconsider her tale. They unearthed letters. They found inconsistencies. They asked dangerous questions. If Königsmark was guilty of treason, why was there no body? If Sophia was unfaithful, why was her punishment not lawful, but personal? And most damning of all, What was George Louis so afraid of? That he had to make her disappear without a word? In 1840, over a century after her death, a collection of Sophia's surviving letters was published in Germany. They were hesitant, gentle, haunted. Not the writings of a seductress, but of a woman aching to be known. "I am not what they say I am," one letter reads. "I am only what they never dared ask." Readers were shocked, moved, and outraged. The court of Hanover had been long gone by then, but its shadow still lingered. And for the first time in history, public sympathy shifted. She was no longer the adulteress. She was the wronged wife, the exiled queen, the forgotten soul whose greatest crime had been to need love in a world built on bloodlines. Today, historians mostly agree. There was no legal justification for her exile. There was no evidence strong enough to deny her title, her name, her freedom. What happened to Sophia Dorothea was not justice. It was erasure. A political maneuver cloaked in moral outrage, a husband silencing an inconvenient wife, a monarchy choosing image over truth, a system that punished not action, but autonomy. And yet, her story remains unfinished, because each generation sees her differently. In the 18th century, she was scandal. In the 19th, she was tragedy. In the 20th, she was feminist metaphor. And now, she is a mirror. For anyone who has ever been silenced, for any woman told that her desires are dangerous, for any soul locked away, not for what they did, but for what they refused to endure. Adulteress? Maybe. But if so, was she not also betrayed? Was her betrayal not preceded by years of isolation, humiliation, abandonment? And even if she loved another, does that justify 30 years of silence? No trial, no voice, no grave with her name on it. Is that justice, or is that fear dressed in royal velvet? History rarely revisits the women it erases, but Sophia Dorothea would not stay buried. She lingered, in letters, in songs, in fig trees breaking through brick. And in that persistence, she rewrote her story, not as victim, but as witness. A witness to what happens when power chooses silence over truth. A reminder that no wall is thick enough, no lock strong enough to contain a woman who still has something to say. There is no grand painting of Sophia Dorothea in Westminster. No official portrait in the Hanoverian archives. No marble effigy in the royal vaults beneath St. George's Chapel. And yet, her image endures. Not in oil and frame, but in fragments, in ghosts, in echoes caught between the bricks of Alden House and the brittle pages of unsent letters. If you were to visit the crumbling ruins of that manor today, you'd see no crown, no plaque, but you might feel something, an unease, a presence, the trace of a woman who refused to fade quietly. They say in one of the upper rooms, sealed for decades until long after her death, there remained a single portrait, half concealed behind decaying curtains. Not a royal commission, not a coronation canvas, a private work, modest, unfinished. A woman seated not on a throne, but on a plain wooden chair, her hands folded, her gown simple, no jewels, no scepter, no crown, but her eyes. They burn through the canvas, not pleading, not weeping, but steady, knowing, as if she sees through time, as if she knows she's being watched, and does not care. The artist remains unknown. Some say it was a servant with a hidden gift. Others claim it was Königsmark himself before he vanished. An impossible theory, but one whispered with fervor by romantics. But one detail confirms its truth. In the bottom right corner, nearly erased by mildew, is the faint outline of a fig leaf, not drawn, sewn into the canvas. Tiny, deliberate, her symbol, her memory, her defiance. When the portrait was discovered in the 1800s, it was almost destroyed. Hanoverian officials considered it an embarrassment, a reminder of dynastic cruelty. But one scholar intervened, a woman, a historian. She had spent years chasing fragments of Sophia's life. And when she saw the painting, she said simply, "Let her face be seen." They took her voice, not her gaze. The portrait was cleaned, preserved. Today, it hangs. Not in a royal gallery, but in a small museum in Celle, not far from where Sophia was born. It is not listed as a major attraction. There is no fanfare, no velvet rope. But those who stand before it, don't forget it. For centuries, women like Sophia Dorothea were written out of history in ink made from silence. But silence, like time, cracks. And when it does, something shines through. Something human. Not perfect, not saintly, but real. And that is what makes her image so enduring. Because she does not ask to be pitied. She asks only to be remembered. That portrait, simple, unadorned, has since become a quiet symbol among historians, artists, and writers alike, not of rebellion, not of scandal, but of the cost of being forgotten. It hangs beside a glass case, inside of which rests the only surviving piece of her handwriting, not locked away in state archives. A scrap of a letter, torn at the edges, barely legible. It reads, "I am still here." No date, no salutation, no signature. Just 5 words. 5 words that echo louder than any decree ever issued against her. And still, she returns. In plays, in poems, in novels passed from hand to hand in small German bookstores. Modern authors have taken her up like a torch, rewriting her story as one not of adultery, but of abandonment. Not of scandal, but of suffocation. Not of shame, but of survival. Her figure appears in feminist essays, in exhibitions titled "Queens Without Crowns," in movements demanding justice for women locked away by families, governments, faith. Sophia Dorothea has become more than a historical footnote. She has become an icon of silence reclaimed. But for all the scholarship, all the reinterpretation, it is still her image that haunts most. That small, unassuming painting. The eyes that see more than they say. And the fig leaf, a symbol not of shame, but of shelter, of memory, of a love that, even erased, grew roots so deep it cracked the walls that tried to contain it. In the cold corridors of power, kings come and go. Thrones rise and fall. Portraits are replaced, repainted, removed. But she remains, not as queen, not as traitor, not even as martyr, but as presence, uncrowned, unforgiven, but unforgotten. History often celebrates power. It records victories, crowns, bloodlines, laws. It tracks the movements of armies and the decrees of kings. But what it often forgets is love. Not the ceremonial love of state marriages or political alliances, but private love. the kind that defies expectations, the kind that blooms in silence, the kind that, when discovered, terrifies those who rule. Because love, unlike law, cannot be controlled. And Sophia Dorothea, she loved, softly, secretly, desperately, dangerously. And for that, she was punished more severely than any criminal of her age. She did not rebel with weapons. She did not incite war or treason. She simply desired something not written into her marriage contract: joy, tenderness, a name said with meaning. But in the halls of Hanover, that was enough. Enough to mark her, to silence her, to vanish her. Because to a cold and calculating monarchy, a woman who loves beyond her role is a threat. And a queen who dreams of freedom is treason incarnate. The story of Sophia Dorothea is not just a historical account. It is a mirror, held up to every system that punishes emotion, to every tradition that cages women in expectation, to every man who wields silence like a blade. It is the quiet scream of every person told to stay in their place, of every voice buried because it spoke too loudly or too softly. And it is a reminder that even locked doors cannot erase longing, that walls do not kill memory, and that a woman, even stripped of title, family, voice, can still become legend. When I first came across Sophia Dorothea's name, it was buried in a paragraph. No image, no emphasis, just a brief mention. Wife of George I, later confined. That was all. A woman who once stood next to a crown, reduced to a comma between two men's names. But when I began to read her letters, to study the few surviving documents, the fragments of gossip, the rhythm of her life, I realized something. She hadn't disappeared. She had simply been covered up, layer by layer, by royal fear, by patriarchal shame, by historical convenience. And yet, there she was. In every line of ink she risked, in every rumor that refused to die, in every woman's voice that now speaks in her place. I've written of queens who ruled with armies, of kings who burned cities to claim their legacy. But this is a story of a woman who fought with silence and won, not in her lifetime, but in ours, because we are still speaking her name. We are still reckoning with the system that erased her. We are still learning how terrifying love can be to those who demand obedience. Sophia Dorothea of Celle never sat on a throne, but in remembering her, we see more clearly the cost of forgetting. She reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous thing a woman can do is feel. And the most powerful thing history can do is finally listen. Let this story be a grave unsealed, a silence broken, a name reclaimed, not to judge, not to romanticize, but to witness, to stand, if only for a moment, beside the fig tree in Alden and say, "We see you now."